What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to It's Actually Easy. This video is number 2 in our series where you're going to learn how to code in Python. And today we are going to be going over if statements. Now, when I started to learn how to program, if statements were a turning point for me because it's when I actually started to feel smart. So to understand what if statements are, what we're gonna do is create a simple Magic 8-Ball game that you'll be able to show your friends and prove to them that you too can do smart things. So as a reminder, we are using our phones and tablets to learn this stuff, so make sure you have an app downloaded that'll let you write code, or watch my first video on variables for suggestions on what apps to use. Alright, so to get started, what we're going to want to do is create a new Python file. So let's go up to our folder icon. Let's click on open. We'll click on our page with a plus icon. And now let's name this Magic 8-Ball and press OK, and now we're ready to go. So before we take a deep dive into if statements and start creating our game, we'll want to define what if statements are. So let's jump to Google and ask the question, what are if statements? So our first result says, in computer science, conditional statements, conditional expressions, and conditional constructs are features of a programming language which perform different computations on actions depending on whether a programmer specified Boolean condition evaluates to true or false. Yikes. So that particular statement is written with such a high degree of technical exactness that the average person is going to have a really hard time understanding what if statements are doing conceptually. So imagine it's summer and you're late to work and you're rushing to get ready and you don't take note of the weather outside. So when you go to open your door to go to your car, you notice that it's raining. So in your mind you'll say, oh, I'm gonna go grab a raincoat, or I'm gonna get an umbrella, or maybe you don't own either of those, so you go and get a trash bag and put it over your head and run to your car as fast as possible. Whatever it is, when you stop to think, I need to protect myself from the rain so I don't get wet, you actually performed an if statement. You know it's summer, but you said, if it's raining, then I'm gonna go get something that's gonna help me not get wet. Another example is when you're driving and your gas gauge is low. If your gas gauge is low, then you go get gas. In programming, this if-then logic is widely used, and you've probably encountered it more than you even realize. Pretty much every time you fail to enter your password incorrectly, the code behind the scenes is saying, if this password exists, then let them into the program. Otherwise, if this password does not exist, then display a message that says the username or password is incorrect. So now that we better understand what if statements are doing conceptually, let's go back to our app and learn how to use them. So to get started, what we'll do is we're gonna write the word import, and then I'm gonna write the word random. Now this concept is not related to if statements, though I'm intentionally including it to make this program work the way that I want it to. I'll cover this more in detail in a future video, but in general what we're doing is we're importing what's called a module. And in this case, we're importing a module that has the name random. Really what modules give you are pieces of code that do certain things, so you don't necessarily have to do it yourself every single time. Our module called random is going to give us code that helps generate random numbers, so we don't have to create a random number generator from scratch. So now that we have our random module imported, we're going to want to create a variable that will represent the value of that random number that will be generated. So I'm going to go to a new line and type random number. I'm going to say that's equal to random dot rand int with an open parenthesis, a 1, a comma, an 8, and a closing parenthesis. Now you might be thinking, that looks intense, that's some hardcore programming stuff. Don't worry, it's actually easy. When you see random.randint, all it's really doing is telling Python, hey, I want to use the module random that we just imported. When you see randint, all that is a set of code that's going to help us generate random numbers, and it just so happens that its name is randint. It's actually short for random integer. So when I write random.randint, I want to use the randint piece of code to generate random numbers, and that's going to be within the random module that we just imported. After the word randint, you probably saw that I put the numbers 1 and 8. So essentially all that's doing is it's telling that randint piece of code to only generate random numbers between the number 1 and the number 8. Because of course, we're trying to mimic a Magic 8-Ball game. So now that we have this, you might be wondering, why do we even need random numbers in the first place? And you'd be surprised how useful random numbers are in programming and actually how frequently they're used. In our case, we want to use random numbers because we want a random outcome. You don't shake a Magic 8-Ball knowing the result, you happen upon the result by chance. The fact that the outcome is random makes it feel more meaningful once you finally get the result. So now that we have that, we can finally get to the core of this video, which is writing our if statements. And if you haven't guessed it, we're going to use our random number variable to help display each of our Magic 8-Ball outcomes. What we want to say is if the random number is equal to 1, then display this message. If the random number is 2, display a different message. If the number is 3, display another message, and so on. In order to do this, we're going to go to a new line and we're going to write if. Then we're going to type out our random number variable. We're going to do 2 equal signs, type the number 1, and then a colon. So let's break this down real quick. Essentially, if I were to read this left to right, it's saying if our random number variable is equal to 1, then do something. The question you might have is, why are there 2 equal signs when earlier we created a variable and we only used 1 equal sign? The main difference here is in our variable, we're giving something a value, versus in our if statement, we're comparing 2 values. When we made our variable, we were telling it to represent a random number between 1 and 8. But with our if statement, we're not telling it to represent a value. We're telling it to compare 2 different values. So whenever you want to do a comparison or evaluate 2 different things, you'll use 2 equal signs. And you might say, that's kind of weird. And quite honestly, you might be right. But that's just how a lot of programming languages work. They're designed to understand certain things. And if you don't write those certain things, then they'll basically say that they don't know what you're trying to do. So as a general rule, when you're comparing 2 things in Python in this way, you will use 2 equal signs. So your next question is probably about the colon at the end of the if statement. This has to be there in order for the if statement to work. Essentially what it's representing is the word then. So when I say if the variable random number is equal to 1, then do something. So essentially that colon's marking a point in the program to say if that variable actually equals 1, then do everything after that colon as part of that whole if statement. So let's go to a new line and you'll see that when we do, line 6 is automatically indented. This is just another thing that Python needs in order to understand what you're really trying to do. What this indent does is it tells Python that what you're about to write is a part of the if statement above, and it should be run if our variable actually equals the number 1. Depending upon the app that you're using, it might automatically indent it for you. It might not, so you can put a space. You could put 4 spaces. Actually press tab if you have that on your keyboard. But essentially, all that really matters is you need to have some sort of indent to allow Python to understand that yes, this is a part of the if statement, and go ahead and execute that code if our variable actually equals the number 1. So what I'm going to write here is going to be very similar to what we saw in our video on variables. So essentially what I'll do is I'll write the word print, I'll have opening and closing parentheses, I'll do 2 single quotes, and now anything that I put within these 2 single quotes is going to be the message that's displayed on screen. So in very typical Magic 8-Ball fashion, I'm going to write, "It is decidedly so." So now, reading this if statement from left to right, it says, if our random number variable equals 1, then display the message, "It is decidedly so." So now we need to write some code in the event that our random number variable equals the number 2. So what I can do is I can copy this if statement that we just wrote, And now if we do, we can paste it just below, and we can tweak this to now satisfy the case where our random number variable equals the number 2. So what I'll do is I'll now change this message. I'm gonna delete it's decidingly so. Now I'll change it to not likely. I'll go up to my number 1 and change it to the number 2, because remember, now we're saying if our random number variable equals 2, display a different message. So I'll type the number 2, and the last thing I need to change is I need to go to our first word, which is if, and I need to change it to the word elif. I know, super weird, it's E-L-I-F. What the heck does that even mean? Elif, in short, stands for else if. In other words, you can pretty much think of it as the word otherwise. When you're writing an if statement, we say if our random number equals 1, then display a message. Otherwise, if our random number equals 2, display a different message. So we use elif to say otherwise in our program. So let's change this if to elif, and the best part about this is there's actually not a lot more that we have to do. We can copy and paste these 2 lines of code 6 more times and we're basically done. And the funny thing is copying and pasting in the programming world is actually pretty common. It is not that rare to go throughout your program, copy one piece of code and paste it somewhere else. You can also go to a different program that you wrote a couple months ago, copy that, paste it into your new program. It's not uncommon to take a fellow teammate's code and paste it into what you're working on. And quite frankly, copying and pasting from the internet happens all the time. So if you can copy and paste, you're probably a programmer. So to finish this up, we'll copy our elif statement and paste it 6 more times, and we'll want to be sure to edit each one by changing the number that we're comparing to our random number variable, as well as changing the message to be displayed with each outcome. So I went ahead and copy and pasted that elif statement 6 times. You can see for each time I changed the number that we're comparing our random number variable to. So you can see equals 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And you can see for each of those outcomes the message is also different. So you can see we have it is certain, doubtful, yes, no, the outlook is good, and of course the infamous ask again later. So once you have what I do, go ahead and ask this Magic 8-Ball program a question and see what answer it gives you. So I'll ask, will this video get 1,000 likes? Not likely. Well, regardless of what happens, I hope you enjoyed the video. So if you did learn something, feel free to leave a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next video.